Hello and welcome to Happy You Asked, the podcast where we explore happiness one awkward conversation at a time. And I am your host, Erin Clare. With me today is Dr. Lara Aknin, who is a distinguished professor in the Department of Psychology at Simon Fraser University. She is also an editor of the World Happiness Report, a former fellow with the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and recent chair of the Lancet's COVID-19 Mental Health Task Force. She holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of British Columbia. Dr. Aknin, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Everybody gets the same first question, and none of our specialists like it that much, but it's what is your definition of happiness?
I use a definition of happiness that I think is pretty common in the field of positive psychology or the science of happiness research, which is both being happy in your life, so as you experience it, but also happy with your life, which is kind of stepping
Mm,
back and evaluating this as a whole. That description is not my own. It was proposed by Dr. Sonia Lubomirsky, who I think has done a bunch of incredible research in this space, but I think it both captures the momentary experiences, but also yeah, people's cognitive assessments, their thoughtful assessments of their life too.
Has this definition changed for you over time? You're like, no, that's it. It's
No,
with this
I
one.
feel like I was introduced to that definition pretty early on in my graduate school career, and I feel like I know there are other working schools or definitions of what happiness or well-being can include, but I find it to be one that I think makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's kind of organized. It captures both the positive and negative of current experiences, and this holistic kind of cognitive assessment. And I also think one of the reasons it's really helpful for me is that in my mind it kind of separates what are the predictors of happiness from the experiences of well-being and happiness.
Hmm.
Whereas I think some definitions kind of put those in closer proximity, which I have a hard time holding together in my head.
Mm. So you've spent your career really showing that giving makes us happier than getting.
Yes.
Yeah. So when did you first realize that was what you wanted to do? That was your life's work?
I think in retrospect, I could probably look back and find, hints of it from my early days. I have a pretty clear memory of, I think around the age of 12, my parents' anniversary coming up, and my younger brother and I thinking about ways in which we could give. Like, I thought, we could put together the $50 I had in my bank account and the $20 he had hidden under his desk, and we could, take our parents for like this pretty expensive dinner. And in retrospect, I realized that wouldn't have been the case. But I think I've always been really interested in the kind things that people do for one another, and intrigued by it and moved by it. But I think when it really started to take shape was when I was in graduate school, because I met Elizabeth Dunn, who ended up becoming my graduate supervisor, and she had been really interested in how people can use money to make themselves happy. She had just become a new faculty
Hmm.
member, and I think for the first time had a paycheck that covered more than just her essentials, and was trying to think how she could use these funds to increase her well-being. And I had always been really interested in the acts of kindness that people do for one another, and so we kind of just put these things together, and I was just deeply intrigued by it and started thinking about it pretty often. And a few decades later, here I am still asking versions of that same question.
Can you walk us through the original experiment, spending on others versus yourself?
Yes, yeah. So probably one of the first experiments I got to do at graduate school was this really fun one where I went out in the morning hours on campus at the University of British Columbia, which is where I did my degree, and I approached students just walking around in public spaces. I invited them to take part in a study on everyday spending choices, and if they agreed, I went into my backpack and I pulled out a paper envelope. That either had $5 or $20 inside, a $5 or $20 bill, along with a small slip of spending instructions that
Mm.
said, please use this money by 5 p.m. today. And there were two variants of these spending instructions. One asked people to spend it on themselves by way of a bill or expense or a gift for themselves. And the other set of instructions asked people to use the money by 5 p.m. on a gift for someone else or a donation to charity. And so we told them, spend by 5 o'clock because a research assistant will call you on the phone number you provide at the end of the day just to ask you some questions. And so at the end of the day, a researcher, not the one who met them in the morning, but another one who was unaware of their spending instructions and how much money they received, called them and asked them a series of questions about how their day went and how they spent their money and how happy they were. And what we found was that people randomly assigned to spend money on other people were happier at the end of the day than people who spent on themselves. And interestingly, the money amount people received didn't really matter so much. It was more about who they spent it on that had kind of this clear, this clear impact on their well-being.
So you've replicated versions of this experiment, right? Across
Mhm.
what was it, 136 countries or something insane like that?
Yeah, well, so we use data from the Gallup World Poll, which has nationally representative data from 136 countries, where we found that people, in general, not in every place, but by and large, and in all regions of the world, in places where people are more people donate more money to charity. There are higher levels of life satisfaction and well-being in those places, and it's impressive to see because it's not just pocketed, for instance, in places where there are high levels of GDP per capita or, places that might be especially privileged. You can imagine that, yes, it feels nice to give when you have extra money to give away, but maybe when people have very limited resources, they aren't able to give. And perhaps it might be very stressful to give things away because you don't have your own basic needs met.
Mhm.
But contrary to that, we observed that higher levels of generosity were associated with greater well-being around the world. And we've run some follow-up experiments to help us try to figure out what's causing what there.
Yeah, was there any place that it didn't hold?
There were a few countries, so there were a few countries that were not significantly, there was no significant positive association. There were a few places where there was a negative association, but it was not significant. And then there were only a few countries, I'm trying to remember which one. I think it was like the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, was one of the few countries in which we saw a significantly negative relationship.
Hmm.
And we've shown in one of our papers, in the paper presenting these findings, it's a map of the world and it's color coded by the strength of the relationship. So you can see where it's significant, positive, significant, but not, sorry, positive, but not significant. Anyway, we've showed that to many different types of scholars to try to understand if there's any meaningful pattern. And long story short is we haven't been able to find like one perfect resolution for the countries where we see these significant negative associations. They just happen to be few. So chances are there might be a lot of things going on, but it might also be the case that just with a lot of universals that people have argued for in the past, sometimes there are exceptions to the rule. Even though most of the time it works as predicted, it's not always the case.
Yep. That that's just also human beings, right?
Yes,
What we do.
complicated. We're sure
Yeah.
complicated.
Now you've outlined some conditions under which giving makes us happiest. Can you explain those to us?
Sure, yeah. So based on some of our research, but other people's research, we've identified kind of three what we call in the literature moderators, but three conditions under which giving is most likely to make people happy. So one is when people give in relational ways. So here's an example I have experienced it, also used to hopefully illustrate this. If you have a friend's birthday coming up, you could imagine buying them a gift certificate to their favorite restaurant or taking them for dinner at that same restaurant. You might spend the same amount of money in both instances, but when you take them for dinner, you get this relational experience with the other person. And so those face-to-face exchanges or opportunities where spending money on others can foster a sense, either build or foster a sense of connection, are more likely to turn into happiness or emphasize the emotional rewards of giving. Another instance is when people feel like they've chosen to give as opposed to feeling forced to give. Again, this might seem intuitive, but I think there are lots of times now as a parent that I feel like I'm trying to scaffold my kids to give and not force them to give. So I try to keep that in mind. But also sometimes, um, yeah, if I told you here's this money that you must donate, it doesn't feel like it's of your own volition, of it's your own choice, and sometimes people might actually push back or react to that. And so I think the beauty is trying to encourage people to find ways in which they can give, that they choose to support or they choose, and that might be how much they give, to which causes they give, how they give. There's a lot of opportunity to inject a sense of choice. And then the third and final condition or moderator that increases the emotional rewards of giving is giving in ways that you feel like you've had a positive impact. Now,
Mm,
again, in a perfect scenario, we would probably, design that all the time. But for instance, I often think about I give to a number of charities, and I think some of them do, and maybe it's based on cause, but I think some charities are so good at showing you how your dollars translated to help the cause. And other charities that, again, maybe by nature of what it is they're working on, just don't have that same kind of tangible evidence to show.
mm,
And I think when we can see or imagine how our gift is improving the lives of another person or something we care about, we're much more likely to feel good about it. I mean, my
mm.
colleagues and I have done some work where people are giving to the exact same umbrella charity, but sometimes subsidiaries will just say thank you so much and it ends there. And some subsidiaries will say, here's exactly what we did with your $10. We bought a bed net to stop the spread of malaria through Africa. You can imagine, you know exactly what your dollars have done. And so people tend to feel better in the latter context.
Definitely, I would, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and it's that idea that comes up over and over. The knowledge then helps us, and the unknown just is confusing, right?
right.
Yeah. So volunteering, though, we've shown that
Hmm.
that doesn't have this clear causal link to happiness. Why is that?
Well, yes, so some evidence. So, although there's a lot of correlational evidence linking volunteering and happiness, so people who volunteer tend to be happier. The causal evidence, or what we like knowing that volunteering increases happiness for certain, is a lot fuzzier. Part of
Mm,
the difficulty there is that there are just fewer experiments that have looked at this. So, my colleagues and I have focused primarily on financial generosity. And I think there are fewer studies in the literature that have looked at giving time. That being said, the evidence out there I think is a little bit more mixed. Part of it might be based on some of these moderators that we just talked about. So, some of the studies that first looked at whether volunteering leads to higher levels of happiness looked at this in school-based programs where students are required to
mm,
help. Those kind of service learning courses. And certainly, don't get me wrong, there are ways in which you could inject a sense of choice, and students might feel like they have chosen to do it. But when students are required to, say, volunteer 50 hours of service over the course of a semester, they might not feel like that was something they wanted to do and resent it, perhaps a little. That might, so hopefully that's not often the case, but you could imagine that being a problem. And the other challenge is just that it's harder for researchers to with financial generosity, we can get grants, give people money, and ask them to give it away. It's much harder for researchers to give people time. Not impossible, but it's harder. So I think those experiments are just harder to run. That being said, there is newer work on this topic that I think presents a little bit more evidence in support of volunteering leading to happiness. One of the main study that I'm really thinking about was done by Christian Krekel and colleagues right in the wake of COVID-19. He's based, I think, at the London School of Economics, and he took advantage, he's an economist by training, and he took advantage of this huge upsurge of volunteering in the United Kingdom in the wake of COVID. A whole bunch of people, I think it was like the largest volunteer mobilization since the war.
mm,
Thousands of people volunteered to help their neighbors or their, elderly neighborhood citizens who needed assistance because they couldn't leave their house and go buy groceries or couldn't pick up medicine and whatnot. And he looked at people who had volunteered to assist with these programs and who were assigned tasks and people who volunteered but weren't assigned tasks. And he had evidence, collections of people's well-being over the course of, like, they were buzzed or beeped or emailed for their happiness reports later on. And what they found was consistent with what we have seen before, such that giving or volunteering time was in fact associated with higher levels of happiness in this large field study. So I think, the jury is still out. Perhaps there might be other conditions we need to take into account. But yeah, up until recently, the evidence hasn't been nearly as overwhelming for volunteering leading to happiness as financial generosity leading to happiness.
well, and I mean, it's not that we don't see many miserable people volunteering a lot. Typically, the
Yes,
volunteer usually, pretty content, right? And you want to
yes,
give of your time, so I
exactly.
imagine it will be positive. I imagine.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It's true. But your point raises a really interesting methodological feature, which is volunteering and happiness are almost always correlated. And usually happy people are more likely to volunteer, right? It takes a
Yeah.
certain kind of healthy, stable person who can put their hands up and say, I have time to go out and help others. And so it's really important we don't just look for these associations, but we run experiments to see whether people randomly assigned to do it then feel
Mhm.
better, right? And so that's
Yeah.
why I was trying to say that it's hard to run these studies, but they're really important.
Yes, and that idea of encouraging people to do this, either
Mhm.
volunteering or giving.
Yeah.
Now, if we know that giving makes people happier, why don't they give more? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky question and one I've thought about a lot over the years. And I think, here's what I've come to think is that I think in a broad sense, we know and we appreciate that other people are an important source of happiness for us, and that many of our grandmothers or our religious texts or people in our lives have told us that giving is good. Um, and I think we have an appreciation at large. But when push comes to shove, I think we don't always make those choices. So, in some of our earliest work, actually, we found that spending money on others leads to higher levels of happiness than spending on yourself. But when we went out on campus and asked 100 something students what they thought would make them happier, spending $5 on yourself, $20 on yourself, five on someone else, or 20 on someone else, the overwhelming majority said that they would be happier spending on themselves. And so I think while we have this broad appreciation of the happiness that kindness can bring, when we pull out $5 from our wallet, we don't always look for opportunities to spend on others. We might be kind of more likely to spend on ourselves. And that might be one of the main reasons for this apparent disconnect is we don't realize that each of these spending opportunities are opportunities to maybe act more generously. We have these routines, we have a default that, yeah, in general, that's a good idea. But right now, I'm just buying myself this coffee, or right now, I need to pay for this. And so we miss out perhaps on maybe some of these everyday sources of joy.
And while it's harder to, do the experiments on it
Hmm.
from a social psychology perspective, all these ads, buy, 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 there's a scarcity mentality.
Yeah,
Um, and so that makes it feel like, well, it wouldn't be smart for me to give money, right?
yeah,
Because I need to always be making more, and if I made it or got it, then it should be for me. And that's sort of that, especially capitalist structure.
yeah.
And but that's hard to say then, what do we do to help people understand that giving voluntarily will actually make them happier? What's the
Hmm.
intervention? And I don't know. Do you have ideas?
Well, yeah, I think forcing people is not the right move. I think reminding people. So one thing that I think telling people that giving is going to make them feel good is a little bit of a tricky dance, right? Because that might shift their motives for giving. If people are doing it to feel good, um, then maybe it's not this very other oriented, altruistic type motivation. Instead, it's really just a means to an end so that I feel better. And so I've tried to walk that line, like I've tried to be really careful about it. But what I do think can really be helpful is reminding people of a previous instance in which they helped. That
Mm,
tends to lead people to see the impact of their generosity. Usually, if people are really engaged in that reflection, they get this emotional benefit from reflecting on this past instance of helping, and that happiness can or can inspire future giving. And so if
hmm,
people reflect upon how they've helped in the past, they feel pretty good about it, and that can prompt future generous behavior.
that makes a lot of sense. Now, if the happiness from giving, creates more giving, which creates more happiness, is there a limit to the cycle? Does it keep going forever?
That would be not, you know what? So we've studied a bit this positive feedback loop, um, and I mean the challenge and maybe the beauty of this is that the happiness rewards of a one-off act of generosity don't last forever, right? So if I take my brother for coffee, I'm not going to feel good. I'll feel good in the moment, chances are. I might feel good at the end of the day, but at the end of the month, I'm not going to be riding high from that coffee I bought my brother. Many things have happened in between. My life has got, we're bombarded with lots of information and experiences over and over again. So a one-off act of generosity doesn't necessarily lead us to ride high. That being said, what I do think that means is that there's opportunities. So I think that what that could encourage us to do is to kind of engage in these acts to try to make it more frequent. And then we get these small little bouts of enjoyment. People are likely to hopefully pass that forward. So when people have maybe received an act of kindness, they feel compelled to pay that forward. So while one singular act might not be a panacea for solving, it's not going to last forever. It might encourage you to give again, and it might encourage the recipient to pay it forward. And so I think that's more likely to lead to this
Mm.
positive spiral than just within one person from one act.
Oh, yeah, like rippling out. Yeah,
Yes, yeah.
yeah. Your lab also recently studied reaching out to old friends.
Yeah.
What happened in that study?
Well, yeah, so we were really interested in this idea of reaching out to old friends. And to be honest, when we started this research project, we were more interested in figuring out in which conditions people would be more likely, like under what life circumstances people would be more likely to reach out to old friends. Might the new year, with all this fresh opportunity, encourage more people to rekindle old relationships? And long story short, what we found was in an effort to try to determine a benchmark of how frequently people reach out to old behavior, we were dumbfounded by how aversive this seemed to people. Most people told
Hmm.
us they didn't want to reach out to old friends. They were neutral about the idea of doing it in the moment, but neutral about the idea of it in general, and really averse to it in the moment. And so we thought, well, maybe that's just what people say, but what will people actually do if we make it pretty easy for them to reach out to an old friend? So we ran these experiments where we were recruiting hundreds of people to these online experiments where they had to first and foremost to participate. They had to tell us that they had an old friend, so that was someone who they cared about with whom they had lost touch. Then we wanted to make this as easy and likely as possible. So we said, make sure that this person is someone who you'd like to reach out to, but who you also think would like to hear from you, and who you have contact information for. And hundreds of people said, yep, I can do that. And then we said, great, spend the next 2 minutes writing a message to this person if you were going to reach out. And then when 2 minutes were up, if they wanted to, they went to the next page and we said, the study's not even going to go on for 1 minute. So why don't you just take this 1 minute to take the message you drafted? Here it is. We've put it back on the screen. And we said, why don't you just send it to your old friend? You said you had their contact information. Open up an email, send a text message, and just pass it along. Um, and then we asked them, hey, be honest with us. Did you actually send the message? We gave them three response options that were yes, no, and maybe later. And the maybe later option was just a polite way of saying, no, I didn't. So they had this like socially acceptable out. And what we found was that only 30% of people sent their note, even when we thought we made this, we couldn't think of any way to make it easier. We tried, my friend Jill and I, who is the collaborator and co-author on this project, we thought, well, let's try convincing people that this is a good thing. Let's tell them not in one condition. We told them, don't overthink it, just press send. We tried everything we could think of. We took all of people's excuses and we tried to preempt them, and still we could almost never move this estimate of roughly 30%. So we had a really hard time trying to get people to reach out to old friends. The only one thing that did work was basically was like a warm-up task. So instead of trying to convince people this was a wise thing to do, um, we got people to send messages to current friends, like spend the
Hmm.
next 2 or 3 minutes, like write your partner, write your yoga buddy, write your whatever. And then when those few minutes were up, we said, okay, now just send a message to an old friend. We didn't give them any extra time to prepare a message. We just kind of quickly pivoted to this new task. And there we were able to increase the rates of reaching out to old friends from roughly 30% to roughly 50%. Still not whopping, but better than the 30% estimate we could hardly budge with all these cognitive interventions. And so I think people get worried about rejection. I think, we could tell them it's probably going to go well. The person will be happy to hear from you. Research suggests that people want to hear from you. You think they want to hear from you, but trying to convince them doesn't seem to work. It's almost a dead end. So we started to tell them, just do it, and that was better off.
That's fascinating. That at the end of it, we're just like, oh, I'll talk to anybody, not them. Nope, sorry.
Yeah,
I just wanted to play. I didn't want to do
exactly,
it.
exactly, exactly. They think they want to hear, they say they want to reach out to this person. They think the person wants to hear from them, but they won't do it.
That's The human brain is so fascinating that we would
Yes.
knowing that would be fine. We're still like, oh, that's too much. I see all the water under the bridge and it's going so fast. Yeah,
Yeah,
not going to do it.
exactly.
Not going to do it. That
Yeah.
is that, as we say in Boston, is wicked cool. It's wicked cool research.
Thanks.
Now, you co-edit the World Happiness Report, which is one of the most wonderful things on earth to me.
Oh,
Can you
wonderful.
tell
Glad
the
to think.
listeners, though, they might not know, can you tell them what it is?
Sure. So the World Happiness Report is a publication that comes out every year on International Day of Happiness, which is March 20th. And it's a report that is written for a general audience and policymakers designed to kind of relay some of the greatest or most actionable insights from the science of happiness. So every year's report over the last couple of years has had a different theme. So this year's report was on social media and well-being. The year before was on generosity and social connection, which was very near and dear to my heart. And there have been the one before that was on generational differences. So each year there's a number of chapters in each report, all commissioned or invited by a group of esteemed authors who know the topic really well, that look at different international perspectives on this central question. But I think one of the main chapters that often brings people into the report is chapter 2, led by John Helliwell, who's an economist at the University of British Columbia, who takes the Gallup World Poll data and ranks countries by their respondents' self-reported life satisfaction. And so we can see how people around the world are rating their life as a whole, which countries are on average at the top of this list, and which of those that are at the bottom. And on this 10, it's an 11-point scale that goes from 0 at the very bottom to 10 at the top. There's quite a bit of variance. So Finland, that has been at the top for the past 9 years, is just below, excuse me, an 8 out of 0 to 10. But I think Afghanistan, who has been at the bottom, is somewhere in the 2 or 3 point range. And as you can imagine, there are many challenges there, but some of it is being ravaged by war. And so there's quite a degree of variation in the human experience of life satisfaction around the globe.
And I encourage everybody to check it out. It is
Mhm.
absolutely fascinating and really just by looking at those numbers and thinking about it, really makes you see everything a bit clearer. Just
Mhm.
it's just fascinating, absolutely amazing stuff. What's something that surprised you the most since working on the World Happiness Report?
Um, there's been lots of insights and revelations over the years. I mean, one of the things that I find really rewarding about it is how collegial, generally speaking, this group of scholars are. I'm a psychologist by training, but every other editor on the report is an economist, and so I think that is just at a snapshot, a glance of how diverse this field of well-being science is. We've had geneticists contribute, we've had economists, sociologists, of course, psychologists, and all the folks who are examining this question, the predictors and the outcomes of human well-being are diverse in their training and their methods and their respective literatures, but have all come together usually quite amicably to examine and prepare these reports. So that has been really lovely. I've also really been surprised by, I don't know, in grad, I don't know, maybe this is like a weird niche surprise, but in graduate school, we spend so much time thinking about the limitations of our particular studies and how to write for a scientific audience. It has been both liberating and frustrating as a learning process to write for such a different audience. Now we're trying to commute. Like I try to think about my mom in every report, thinking, could she understand this chapter? Some of the details are in the fine print and in the footnotes, but could she walk away with this with an understanding based on the figures and the text of what this is? And same for policymakers. We want them to be able to take away digestible, actionable insights from this report. And so it has been both liberating, but also it's a lot of hard work to take our scientific findings and translate them to different audiences. But it's certainly worth the effort.
And are there things that surprise you repeatedly in the rankings themselves that things you don't think people would expect?
You know what? Well, I don't think I would have. I mean, from the outset, before I got into this field, I don't know if I had thought that like the Scandinavian countries would be topping the charts year after year with such success and stability. but in retrospect, I think it has started to make sense to me because while they are not especially high on any singular predictor, they are quite high on these things that we see in our data being being some of the key predictors of well-being around the globe. And many of those, I mean, yes, there's GDP per capita, which provides a sense of stability, but I also think a lot of the Scandinavian social infrastructures provide an opportunity for many of their citizens and residents to feel a sense of security. I think there's a lot of trust in their government. I think there's a lot of social trust among their neighbors, and people feel like they have a high degree of trust in one another, and I think that's one of the key predictors of well-being around the globe. So I think many times it actually I should say that this is one of the main reasons I think the World Happiness Report kind of came to be. For a long time, people thought that these economic metrics were a rough and suitable proxy for how people were living their lives. And kudos to the economists that originally put forward this report saying, you know what? We used to think that GDP, gross domestic product, was enough to capture how a country was doing, but we have better measures of that now. We can ask people how their lives are going, and we can take that as the ultimate criteria. And when we do, we see that yes, GDP per capita is one key factor, but so too is whether you have someone you can count on in times of need, whether you have donated to charity in the past month, whether you trust your economic and your government institutions, and all of those kind of social inputs, I think, go a long way in determining average life evaluations around the globe. And they don't often get as much credit as I think some fields would expect.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why I'm like, oh, everybody read it, everybody, because it's almost a formula. And you look, okay,
Yeah,
what are they doing differently than this? Oh, 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 and it starts
interesting.
making sense. If you want to make a
Mhm.
happy um, society, you look at that report, and people will tell you if they're happy or not, and they're not going to lie. They have no reason to lie about that. They could tell you the truth. So
Mhm.
I encourage everybody to read it every single time it comes out. It's fascinating. Is there a question about happiness, though, that you wish more people would ask or think about?
Hmm. I mean, I think one thing that it continues to inspire and intrigue and puzzle me is just how well-being is so relational. I find like and maybe this is very maybe I'm very biased because this is what it is that I study in a roundabout way. But I think, we as humans have evolved to find safety, security, survival in our alliances, allegiances, and connections with other people. And so it's no surprise to me that social relationships and social connections, and even the most minimal forms of social contact, um, go a long way in terms of influencing our well-being. But I remain still humbled by the fact that time and time again, when we run these studies and when other people run these studies, how important and consequential those things are. And so I think there's a lot of research now starting to emerge showing that even brief conversations with strangers can promote happiness, just as spending time with close others can as well. But I think there's still so much to be learned about like how happiness is relational in those moments. And so we know how one person is experiencing it, but I think this is a pretty fascinating dyadic process about how people are experiencing their time together with one another. And I feel like we're just starting to scratch the surface there.
I agree. What's been absolutely fascinating is talking to all these different experts, and no matter the field, they end up coming to the same type of thing. It's relational, it's
Interesting.
about connections, be it, spiritual experts or, economists or people focused on, entrepreneur and business or neuroscience, all the same thing. It goes back to, in different ways, connections. And it's fascinating to see that
Yeah.
over and over. And it's so hard to make those for so many of us in our, world today. That's all mostly online. So, what should we do you think? Do you have any advice?
Well, first of all, I love the fact that the through line from all these different perspectives is the importance of relationships. I for one am starting to both from the research I do, but also just from like a personal perspective, I'm trying to challenge myself to take more social risks. I feel like kind of consistent with what we were talking about with reaching out to old friends, and it's consistent with the literature on talking to strangers too. I think it's some sense we probably understand that it will go well, but we always fear that this one experience is going to backfire and it's going to be awful. And so I've been trying to encourage myself to, talk to more strangers, to reach out to more old friends, to take more of these social risks, because I think most of the time we are so pleasantly surprised by how, certainly most of the time these experiences are not a catastrophe. If most of the time, worst case scenario, they're going to fall flat or someone ignores you. But sometimes these are life-changing conversations, and sometimes you don't even know the impact you're having on someone else's day. I got off a flight the other day. I was watching a woman. She was pushing a cart with 3 suitcases and pulling one, and I was just about to. I was like, I should stop to help. And before I even fully computed the thought, the person next to me did so. And just watching these
Oh.
small acts of generosity and kindness, I mean, I don't think we fully know what that does for the recipient perfectly in those moments, but we probably know from the literature that the helper is going to feel good. And I feel like most of the time we probably should get out of our own way, maybe out of our own heads, and give
Mhm.
it a shot. And we'll be probably pleasantly surprised most of the time.
And you're exactly right. I think repeating to myself, what's the worst that could happen? It will be awkward, and it's going to be awkward anyway because that's
Mm,
what it's like to be a human being. So go ahead
yeah.
and do it. I think I'll take that advice as well. I have one last question.
Yes.
You get to add a song to the playlist, any song you want.
Huh. A playlist song. I don't know if I have one that's particularly
It doesn't
um
have to be happy. There's no
okay.
rules around it.
It's not unhappy, but it's also not at all related to the research. It's just probably my favorite song if I was asked to pick a song. So it would be Show Me Love by Robin. Do you know
Oh,
that
perfect.
one?
Yes,
It makes
I
me
do.
happy every time I hear it. So yeah,
I love that. That's
that on
absolutely
it.
perfect. That is the perfect song. If it makes you happy, that
Yep,
creates ripples.
there we
Make
go.
other people happy. This research has been fascinating, and I am just honored to talk to you. And thank you so, so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Till next time. Bye bye.